Brilliant. Right. So we will now move on. So we now move on to the probably even bigger issue to us, and it's directly connected, but it's probably a more obvious one when we were actually delivering our mediation, which is the issue of domestic abuse. And I know, sitting as a criminal magistrate, every day I'm in court, there is domestic abuse cases in front of me, and it's so common now. It's very worrying. So I felt it was really important to bring in that. Now, Leeway is a charity that I know well, based in Norfolk, and I think there are similar charities all over the country. It's a shame where there are places that don't have that level of support in a local charity. But so Karen's going to come along and do a presentation about the impacts of the domestic abuse and things to look out for, and the impacts of COVID on it. So I will start the screen sharing, Karen.
Brilliant.
I'm not going to even try to share it, so you roll through it. I will roll it. Just let me know when you want to change the screen.
Sure. Thank you very much. I want to thank Mike for the invitation to present to you today. As Mike mentioned, I'm Karen Osborn, and I'm the Senior Training Officer with Leeway, and we're based in Norfolk. My role primarily is to train frontline professionals working with those experiencing domestic abuse. And something I start with every presentation, regardless of who I'm talking to, is I issue what I call my health warning. I appreciate you're all professionals, often coming into contact with domestic abuse through your work. But if any of you are affected at all by today's presentation, please seek help from friends, from colleagues, from family. And I will talk about some of the agency support at the end of this presentation as well. So that's just the little thing I always throw in whenever I'm talking to people. Next slide, please, Mike. So just very quickly about us. We're a specialist domestic violence and abuse charity supporting adults, both women and men, children and young people across Norfolk and Suffolk. We're affiliated to the national organisation Women's Aid, who are sort of an umbrella organisation that look after a network of over 500 domestic abuse services in England. And a bit about Leeway, we were initially formed by volunteers in 1974 with a £200 startup grant from Norwich City Council. And when you consider that Erin Pizzey opened the first refuge in Chiswick in London in 1971, we weren't that far behind the curve here in Norfolk. And those early volunteers said it was really difficult to prove the need for a support service, as the data really wasn't collected back in those days. And so they were really sort of ahead of the game when they were doing their volunteering. Next slide, please. So today I want to talk to you about what someone may have experienced before they meet with you. Any experience of domestic abuse, whatever the extent, will leave an impact on someone's life. It is still the case in the UK that on average 2 women a week are killed by a violent partner or ex-partner. COVID and lockdowns started the conversation about domestic abuse, and it brought it into the media and the headlines. We talked about how it trapped victims and made it hard for them to get help. But for many, though, a form of lockdown had already been going on for many years in their homes. So often we work with people who think if there's no physical violence, it's not domestic abuse. We'll hear time and again, but he doesn't hit me. Coercive and controlling behaviour is so prevalent in the work that we do. Often women will say it's easier to recover from the physical abuse than the drip, drip, drip of controlling behaviour. I want to focus on economic abuse in this presentation, now specifically recognised in the new Domestic Abuse Act, to show you the devastating impact it has and how often people aren't aware that they're experiencing it. At a time of separation, finances can often move into the spotlight. And finally, I want to talk about how domestic abuse doesn't always stop when the relationship ends. Often other forms of abuse, such as stalking and harassment, can intensify as a way of making the victim return to the relationship. Separation and leaving are the most dangerous times, and safety planning forms a large part of the support we offer. Our work is about empowering people to make their own decisions. The support we offer is based in the community and through our 9 refuges in Norfolk. Unfortunately, as the figures I'll talk about today demonstrate, domestic abuse has a far-reaching ripple effect. Next slide, please. So some basic facts and figures, probably ones that you've come across day to day. 1 in 3 women, 1 in 5 men, 1 in 3 LGBT+, and 1 in 2 transgender. And possibly this is only the tip of the iceberg. I don't know if we'll ever be able to accurately assess the levels of domestic abuse in the UK. You see the figures there from the crime survey in England and Wales showing March 2020, an estimated 2.3 million adults experiencing domestic abuse divided between women and men. And it's estimated there's around 750,000 children being affected by domestic abuse. The average length of abuse a woman will experience is just under 6 years before they seek help. Some will reach out to the service quite early on, others will live with it for years. And unfortunately, a Home Office report in 2019 found that the cost of domestic abuse for the year ending March 2017 was approximately £66 billion a year, of which the biggest cost was £47 billion, was physical and emotional harm incurred by people. Next slide, please. So 1 in 10 offences recorded by the police are in relation to domestic abuse, and each year there are over 1 million calls to the police in England and Wales about domestic abuse. So on average, someone is contacting the police every 30 seconds for help. That's going to be friends, family, neighbours maybe hearing something, or somebody who's directly experienced abuse. And certainly when we look at the figures in Norfolk, the police here on average receive about 40 calls a day. And when you compare that to the calls, 2 burglary calls they receive a day, you can see that domestic abuse is something that's very, very obvious within society. The Ayrsham Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services in 2018 found that a domestic abuse crime is committed every minute in England and Wales. And Safe Lives found that it accounted for 1/4 of all recorded violent crime in the UK. And unfortunately, it's the crime with the most repeat victims. As you can see there, the Office of National Statistics Crime Survey found that 4 in 5 victims of partner abuse do not report to the police. And when I go through some of those barriers to leaving, I'll be discussing a little bit more about why that might be the case. Next slide, please. So Mike asked me to mention a little bit about COVID. And you can see from this statement from the UN Population Fund shows the predicted effect, 15 million more cases of domestic abuse worldwide. Gender experts time and again note that domestic abuse increases when societies are under stress. So things like natural disasters, food shortages and pandemics. And this has led to some professionals referring to this last period as a double pandemic with what's going on. Next slide, please. So some quotes from the early days. This is sort of back to sort of March and April last year. Suzanne Jacobs, the chief executive of Safe Lives, said, really, it's a perfect storm. Lockdowns will lead to a surge in domestic abuse, but also severely limit the ability of services to help. And Rachel Williams, who's a fantastic advocate, as she is herself a survivor, said isolation is a tool of control. Lockdown heightens those tensions and cuts off the escape routes. And certainly as services, we've all been running through the pandemic, all the way through the lockdowns. People have been coming into refuge and leaving their homes. But it is the case, I think, that people felt that there weren't those options for them. Next slide, please. So some work by Women's Aid, again, done in those early days after the first sort of lockdown was announced, really highlighting that it saw an escalation of abuse, that children were experiencing the greater effects in their homes, and that 72% said their abuser had more controls over their lives. Leeway Advice and Support Line during the first lockdown between April and May 2020, we saw a 300% increase to calls to our help and advice line. That could be friends and family worried that they haven't heard from somebody, professionals feeling that they've lost contact maybe with people that they were working with, and also people, when they're able to, reaching out and asking for help and support. So much so that we actually launched an online chat during lockdown to try and give people other ways to be able to reach out and get advice and support. Next slide, please. So again, some late figures coming out from November 2020, a 700% increase in the number of visits to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline in the website from April to June, compared with the first 3 months of the same year. Nearly 260,000 offences flagged up, and also seeing the fact that cautions are raising as well. Provisional data shows there were 64 domestic homicides recorded by the police in England and Wales between January and June of 2020, of which 30 occurred in the period April to June. We went from 2 women a week to 5, which is the highest figure we've had in this country for 11 years. That's the impact it had. Very specifically, the Met Police in April 2020 said officers were arresting on average 100 people a day for domestic violence offences. So that was over 4,000 arrests in April alone. And charges and cautions went up 24% from the previous year. It has always been the case that people have been able to leave. On the 26th of March 2020, the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Act came into force, and it specified 13 situations which amount to reasonable excuse for leaving home. And under Section 6, restrictions on movement, 2, as I say, specifically applied to domestic abuse. But I don't think in those early days that message was getting out, and it was very clear to people that they were able to leave. Okay, next slide, please. So lockdowns did make it difficult for people to seek help. Obviously, you're not able to go out to work. We were being limited to maybe going out to exercise once a day. You weren't seeing friends and family. It made it difficult for finding those sources of support if you weren't able to use the telephone or the